Hi, and welcome to Module 1. In this module, we're going to consider the central concept around which this whole course is constructed, actually, the concept of gender. How is gender conceptualized? What meaning does it have to you and to others? And particularly, what meaning does it have for educators and students in educational contexts? In order to begin considering these questions, we're going to look at the idea of gender by considering 4 resources in this particular module, 2 of which are videos and the other 2 come from written texts. The first is a book by Raewyn Connell in which she talks about various aspects of what we mean by the notion of gender. Raewyn Connell is an Australian sociologist. She's an emeritus professor at the University of Sydney, and she's a very well-known scholar in the area of gender. Her book is actually a classic and well worth spending some time with. I certainly have spent time with it over the years, and I think you'll find it fascinating as well. In fact, you can access the book electronically, so you might want to return to it at some time to read more than what's assigned for this module. In the book, she looks at the ways in which gender intersects with social institutions like law, medicine, and from our perspective, particularly interesting, education. We'll be reading one part of a chapter for this module. The second resource is a video by Dr. Fiona Macaulay. Dr. Macaulay is a professor at the University of Bradford in the UK in the Department of Peace Studies and International Development. Now you might wonder what that has to do with gender, but she makes that quite clear in the video. She has a particular interest in gender politics and policies in relation to the issue of human rights, and in her case, her specialization is the context that she studies most closely in South America. But in this video, she speaks more generally to the broader notion of gender. The video you will be watching is part of a series that was done at the University of Bradford by her department. Because all students going to the University of Bradford study peace studies, no matter what specialization they're in, the video series of which this is a part is meant to introduce students to gender as an element of understanding its intersection with both conflict and peaceful resolutions between social groups. Certainly something that we as educators are often concerned about, both in our classroom context, in the wider school and community context, and even in our own curriculum. And in this video, Dr. Macaulay considers the intersection of peaceful relations and gender. So it has interesting applications for our course. The next video that you're going to be watching is one that features student voices and their understandings of gender. Of course, as educators, students are at the heart of what we do each day. And these students are talking about how they understand gender and how they're coming to terms with understanding themselves as gendered beings. I think you'll find it fascinating because of the very sophisticated level with which they think about, understand, and discuss gender in the context of their own lives and in the context of their experience in schools and so on. Last, and one that I'm certainly familiar with, is the introduction to a book that I wrote, an introduction that I wrote to a book that I had the pleasure of co-editing and contributing to with Dr. Don Wallin, who is an Associate Dean at the University of Saskatchewan in the Faculty of Education, and who, like me, has been president of the Canadian Association for Studies on Women in Education. We met a few years ago now over coffee at a conference, and we're discussing all things gender, and decided that the time had come to write a book that we could draw on the experiences of various people who, some of whom were just beginning scholarship in gender, some of whom had retired, and we were afraid that we would lose their voices. So she and I, and for a while, Sharon Cook at the University of Ottawa, who unfortunately had to withdraw other than contributing a chapter because of health issues in her family, worked together and worked with authors across the country in drawing together perceptions of the effects of gender in education. Our goal in this book actually was to look at whether gender issues as mediated by feminist theories had any effect on education in Canadian schools. In the introduction, I talk, and John and I talk about how feminism that we consider to be, and this is a definition that I think covers what we try to cover in this book, is the study of inequitable access to social benefits along a continuum of gender identities and how to create more equitable access for all. So in thinking about that definition of feminism, we tried to understand how it had enhanced our understanding of gender and its effects in school, and how that understanding has been enacted in education since 1970. So it's a bit of a historical look, which begins when the Royal Commission on the Status of Women was released in Canada. I'll talk more about that later in this video, but I've chosen this text because it's up to date, for one thing, and because it brings the discussion around gender more clearly into an educational context, and specifically a Canadian educational context for those of you who are Canadian educators. But all of the resources in Module 1 provide important background for fundamental understandings that we're going to build on throughout the course. So in these readings and throughout the module, we're going to be grappling with why it's important to understand gender. Well, first of all, gender is a key dimension of our personal and professional lives. The way in which we organize the personal is affected very much by our understanding of ourselves as gendered beings. We can think of all kinds of ways in which we organize our households, for example. Certain people do certain kinds of work in educational organizations. Students are expected to act in particular ways, and so on and so forth in educational settings. And the opportunities that we gain in our professional lives are often related to issues of gender. So we'll be talking about that not only in this module, but we'll be picking up on this theme more specifically as we go through the course. Of concern, of course, is that gender is a subject about which there is a great deal of prejudice, confusion, and misunderstanding and misinformation. We see this a lot in the news, for example, and in other settings. And certainly young people reflect that prejudice, confusing, and misinformation, as do their teachers sometimes. But certainly those of us who are older than the students we teach are not immune to prejudice, confusion, and misinformation. You'll find many examples of that on social media in the so-called, what we call mainstream media these days, and so on. And so we're well aware of how this gets expressed. So understanding gender and how we can think through issues of gender is very important, especially for those of us who have such a significant effect on young people's lives. Gender also organizes our behavior, the opportunities that we have access to, and the practices that we engage in everywhere, really, but importantly from our perspective in schooling and in schools. So we'll be dealing with those issues throughout the course. So let's go back to this title of this slide, Seeing and Understanding the Effects of Gender. Macaulay talks quite eloquently about the importance of seeing gender, seeing the effects of gender. Gender is one of those sort of invisible aspects of our lives. It's so embedded in how we live our lives each day that we just don't see it. It simply is, sort of like the air we breathe. It's there and its effects are profound, but it's not something that we consciously pay attention to or even notice until it's gone, of course. So it's important for us to actually be able to see and understand the effects of gender and the ways in which they play themselves out in ways that are both positive and negative. Part of that comes from coming to terms with what we know about gender. So Connell talks about gender as something that is a social construction. That is, gender is not something that we are physically born with, but it is something that is, to step back, our sexual identity, our sexed being is something that we're born with, obviously. But the ways in which we express that sex being, or a sex being that is not congruent with our actual physical being, that's something that is constructed through layers of social interactions within the social and cultural context in which we find ourselves, and the various aspects of that social context as well. For example, our country of origin, the religion that we practice, and so on, and what's considered normative in terms of how gender is expressed in those various contexts. Who does what work? What is that work worth? And so on are all affected by gender. Gender is monitored by ourselves and those around us. A few years ago, a kindergarten teacher in London, Ontario, wrote a book. She was actually a student at the University of Western Ontario, which is now called Western. She was one of our master's students, actually. And she wrote a book based on her master's thesis called "The Girls Are the Ones with the Pointy Nails." She's a kindergarten teacher, and in it she explores how kindergarten and pre-kindergarten students monitor one another at the borders of what we would call normative gendered behavior, or the behavior we expect of someone who we conceive to be a man, or we conceive to be a woman, or a boy or a girl. And so, for example, if a boy wanted to play in the house center in her class, the other boys, and sometimes the girls, would discipline their behavior because one of their classmates wanted to step outside the boundaries of legitimate gendered expression, as the other students understood it. And the title, "The Girls Are the Ones with the Pointy Nails," comes from a conversation between two of the students in their class. And she must have said something about boys and girls and what boys and girls can do or whatever. And one of the boys, being kind of confused, turned to one of the other boys and he said, "Well, what is a girl then?" And the other boy turned to him and said, "Well, girls are the ones with the pointy nails." So we see prejudice, we see constructions of gender right there that may or may not be correct. So So these gender norms are reinforced through social norms that begin at birth, in fact, even before birth. If you've read my 10 things about me, you'll know that I'm earlier in the course, at the top actually, of E-Class, you'll know that I'm a knitter. It's a hobby that I picked up since retiring, and I thoroughly enjoy it. But what I found fascinating is that on the various blogs and vlogs that I read or watch about knitting, something that comes up often actually is the concern people express, and it's really often quite deep concern about what color should they knit baby clothes for somebody that's going to be having a baby soon, when they don't know the sex of the sex of the baby that's being born. So should they knit pink, or should they knit blue, or should they knit kind of a neutral color like green or yellow? And maybe yellow's a little too close to pink. And this consternation about a color that is totally unrelated to our gendered beings, or our sexed beings certainly, is a really fascinating phenomenon to watch. This kind of reinforcement of gendered social norms right from the time a baby is born, being dressed in pink or blue, boys having, dinosaurs on their little shirts and girls having pink flowers on their little shirts and so on, have nothing to do with caring for the baby or supporting the baby's growth, but have everything to do with gender as a social construction that is monitored and gets reinforced from a very early age. We see this at gender reveal parties, for example, in the kinds of toys that are chosen for children, the way the baby is handled, and handled by men and handled by women. And all of this sets the stage for not only gender norms, but the expectations and opportunities attached to those norms as the child matures. Research suggests, in fact, that by the age of 3, gender norms are already well entrenched. And if you don't believe me, talk to a 3-year-old and you'll find that out very quickly, particularly if they've been to a nursery school or, regularly get together with other groups of children, because gender norms that they may not have been taught, they're quickly taught by other children who have been taught these gender norms. We also know that there's gender diversity, and that most conform to gender norms expected of their sex, even if they don't feel comfortable doing so. Those who are comfortable with societal expectations seen as appropriate to their sex being, that is, those who are what we call cisgendered, may not even notice the power of those gender norms because they just conform within a comfortable range of behavior that is comfortable to them. And they don't experience resistance to how they express themselves as a gendered being. However, those who are uncomfortable with the gender norms as they relate to their sex bodies, that is, those who are gay, lesbian, transgendered, bisexual, two-spirited, and so on, are often excruciatingly conscious of those gender norms, depending on how close or how far away they feel most themselves in terms of those gender norms. Many of those people, in fact, face significant danger because their gendered identity doesn't match normative expression of gendered norms. It's important to remember that those who have lived outside gender norms have existed historically and exist in all cultures, that they have contributed a great deal to society, and have at times in history been accepted and have also been persecuted depending on the law and the social norms. So their contribution to society is often opened up or limited by legal restrictions and social norms that restrict their behavior or their need to closet themselves and so on. Connell argues that because gender norms change over time, and because they are malleable, that is, they can be shifted and changed, and certainly we have seen that, most of us, through our generation at least, there's no fear that they're going to, unlike gender norms that change over time and for which laws change quite dynamically, there is no need to pass laws against the law of physics because they're malleable. There's no fear that they're going to change over time. But there is fear that gender norms are going to change, and because gender is so embedded in our psyches and our sense of ourselves and how we organize ourselves socially, personally, professionally, politically, economically, and so on, the possibility of changes in gender norms generates a lot of fear and a lot of discomfort because of the perception that the social order will be changed too by that behavior or allowing that behavior. This raises fear, and the legal responses that we see it being enacted in various places at this point in history, actually, where there has been an opening up of possibilities, and now in many contexts there's a closing down again. So we've seen that, as we've seen over the past couple of years, can change rather dramatically in response to those fears. The reality, however, is that gender norms are very persistent. They do not change quickly. They are malleable, but they don't change quickly. And certainly within my lifetime, I've seen some significant changes in gender norms. But there's this way in which when someone steps outside of gendered expectations, even when that meets with approval, they're still subject to those who may discipline non-normative gendered behavior through the law or social networks. Those who do not act within gendered norms have to somehow prove that they're still okay and that they're still part of the gender team. So we see this, for example, in this clip that I took out of The Guardian a couple of years ago, where a mother of three is poised to lead the BBC. Why does her being a mother of three have anything to do with her leading the BBC? Well, this, of course, is stepping outside of gender norms. So in order to prove that she's actually still a part of the gender team, the media describes her as a mother of three. They also go on to say that all of the things that she has done and is going to do, and then also that she's a married mother of three, has been named the government's preferred candidate. So before saying that she's been a preferred candidate, again, we establish her credibility as a gendered being. And we see this often. I mean, I can't imagine a male being chosen for this position and this kind of heading being a part of the clipping. I don't think I've ever seen it. If you have, I'd love to know more about it. We see this same phenomenon, for example, for men in elementary school, where they in some ways have to establish their gendered credibility because of fears around those who don't express themselves in a normative way as in terms of their maleness. Or girls and women in sports. Again, we see kind of an over-feminized presentation off the sports field quite often to kind of prove your allegiance to the gendered norms. Of course, this isn't always the case, but often it is, more often than one would expect. And we could argue that the reason is this persistence of gender norms and fear around stepping outside of those gender norms. These examples go to the whole notion of gender expression, which is how we demonstrate or enact our gendered identity. We do so through various aspects of our external presentation. So, for example, when a woman sits down in an airplane and she's dressed in a casual, non-gender specific outfit, and she slouches into her seat and she kind of and spreads her legs and plunks her elbows down on both armrests. Many others viewing these behaviors would be at least perplexed and might even express some disgust by her non-normative behavior. But if a man does the same thing beyond annoyance, if you're the one sitting next to him, there's not the same kind of surprise or consternation. Similarly, if a man's behavior is seen as too effeminate, and he can be disciplined, often more strongly than a woman who expresses male behavior. The way we wear our hair, long, short, shaved, dreads, etc., has generated concern throughout the ages. I'm old enough to remember the Beatles' long hair and the great concern of parents, clergy, police, and so on. And of course, the way we dress is often carefully monitored, particularly in professional settings. And school uniforms, etc., even in the private sphere of our lives. How do you initially interpret the vignette pictured here? A mom walking hand in hand with her daughter? In fact, it's a dad who's going for a walk with his son down to the market square in a town in Germany. His son, according to the news article, likes dresses because he just likes to feel them better on a hot summer day. He's about 3 or 4 years old, and this is his preference. So his dad, in solidarity with his son, walked to the square with him wearing a skirt. I'm sure some eyebrows were raised. In fact, this was considered newsworthy enough to feature this simple walk to the market, something that the people in the town do every day, in the newspaper, and it was picked up internationally. This picture demonstrates how dress is a very powerful indicator of where one fits in terms of gender expression and how difficult it is to step outside of those boundaries. Voice modulation as well is another powerful expression of gender. Whether your voice is high or low, how expressive you are as you talk, and how much pitch goes up and down to express emotions. Whether you uptalk or express yourself more forcefully are all within the continuum of acceptable gendered expression. And we see very often that women uptalk, that is, they kind of go up with the lilt of the voice at the end of a sentence. Very seldom do you see that in men. Men tend to speak more loudly and more forcefully, and that's okay. But if women do that, it's often censured or viewed as unacceptable. So we see these various ways in which we express gender either within or outside of normative structures. As others read our gendered expression through these external markers, they make decisions about our acceptability based on these normative cues. Those decisions about our acceptability have significant repercussions about our acceptability to social groups, professional positions, and so on. The discomfort and lack of acceptability often comes from discomfort and fear around changing gendered norms. Yet we have no connection yet they may have no connection whatsoever to sexual orientation or gender identity. Or they may. So we need to remind young people, and particularly our staff, that gender expression may or may not equate to sexual orientation. And that homophobia, which often causes that kind of visceral reaction to those who act outside of gender norms, is never okay. Homophobia is never okay, including in response to another's gendered expression outside gender norms. Most of you will have seen some version of the genderbread person. As the author's understanding has deepened, various versions have emerged. Version 4 seen here explores various expressions of gender, and for each of the categories of expression, a continuum exists along two continuum. So along womanness and manness, femininity and masculinity. So we have gender identity, gender expression, anatomical sex, who we're sexually attracted to, and who we're romantically attracted to. They may not, in fact, be the same. While this genderbread person suggests a binary notion of gender, this teaching tool actually questions the effectiveness of a binary, because along each continuum are infinite possibilities. The possibilities are endless and may shift over time in each category. Even anatomical sex may change due to surgical intervention. This mem demonstrates that gender is a complex location full of possibilities, but the constrictive norms that limit those possibilities may lead to legal intervention and social censure. It may also lead to structures of privilege and exclusion that can cause great pain for those who do not conform to those norms. In the last article, then, I look at how feminism is being taken up today. As the word feminism has a currency generally that is quite unlike several years ago. I mean, there was a time when, not so long ago actually, when it was unpopular, even dangerous, to identify yourself as a feminist. But everyone from prime ministers to pop stars to movie stars to our neighbors and friends is claiming they're a feminist these days. Yet many of the same issues of gender bias and discrimination remain. In 1968, as a response to a growing women's movement and a very active lobby among women educators and other activists, Lester Pearson, who was Canada's Prime Minister at the time, struck a royal commission on the status of women. Briefs were presented, committee meetings were held, and a document was tabled in 1970 that made recommendations across all sectors, but focused specific and careful attention on education. Here we see some of the protests that led to the committee and the briefs that eventually led to the Royal Commission on the Status of Women that was tabled in 1970. As Rebecca Coulter wrote, the RCSW, or the Royal Commission, listed education as one of 9 public policy areas, particularly germane to the status of women. So that in itself demonstrates that this course has implications, and significant implications, for certainly the status of women, but as we've theorized more fully, for the status of all who are gendered beings. The Commission report set in motion a great deal of activity among teacher organizations and even some parent organizations to counter some of the ways in which education acted as a reinforcer of gender norms, and they called for change. Sex role stereotyping in school resources. You know, mom is always cooking in the kitchen and dad is always coming home with a briefcase. At that time in the Dick and Jane series, if you go back, you'll see that's exactly what it was. Teaching practices that reinforce stereotypes for girls and boys. Girls were expected to act in certain ways and boys in others, and that had effects in how they interacted in classrooms. The gender distribution of work in schools, who gets to do what. And certainly at that time, males were principals and women were teachers. And education policies that reinforce stereotypical gender roles that do not account for broader definitions and understandings of gender. And as we proceed with the course, we're going to pay attention to many of the themes introduced here, but for now in this module, we're going to work on coming to grips with what the meaning of the central concept of gender means, and then we'll consider what it means in our personal and professional lives and those of our students. I apologize for the length of this video. We had a lot to cover. My videos in the next several modules are going to be much shorter, but I felt it was important to really pay attention to many of the themes that we're going to be exploring in this course. And thank you for listening for such a long time. And I hope that you enjoy the readings and the videos that are a part of the preparation for the forum and so on. If you have any questions along the way, please feel free to ask.